Imagine you are 18 years old, standing in a Fifth Avenue bedroom that cost more than most Americans will earn in a lifetime. Your mother has locked the door from the outside. She has told you that if you do not agree to marry a man you have met 4 times, a man who has already confessed he loves someone else, she will die of a broken heart. And you believe her, because you have never been allowed to believe anything else. This is not fiction. This is New York, 1895. The groom will collect $2.5 million in railroad stock before he kisses the bride. The bride will weep through the entire ceremony. Her name is Consuelo Vanderbilt, and her mother will one day testify under oath. I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. Chapter 1. 400 names and not one of them yours. In 1883, the most powerful woman in New York threw a party so expensive it forced a social revolution. Her name was Carolyn Schermerhorn Astor. She was known simply as Mrs. Astor. And the list she kept, a handwritten inventory of every family worthy of her ballroom, contained exactly 400 names. That was the capacity of her drawing room at 350 Fifth Avenue. If you were not on the list, you did not exist. Not in any way that mattered. Not in any way that could be inherited. The Vanderbilts were not on the list. This was a problem measured in tens of millions of dollars. Cornelius Vanderbilt, the family patriarch, had died in 1877, leaving the largest fortune in American history. His grandson, William Kissam Vanderbilt, had married a woman named Alva Smith from Mobile, Alabama. Alva was brilliant. Alva was ruthless. And Alva understood one truth about Gilded Age New York that most new money families could not stomach. Mrs. Astor's list was not a social register. It was a siege wall. You could not charm your way over it. You could not buy a ticket through its gates. The old Knickerbocker families of Dutch descent looked upon railroad money the way a cathedral looks upon a car dealership, with architectural contempt. So Alva chose a different strategy. She would make Mrs. Astor come to her. In March of 1883, Alva Vanderbilt hosted a costume ball at the new Vanderbilt mansion on Fifth Avenue. The house alone had cost $3 million. It was modeled after a French chateau. The ball would cost over $250,000 more. Adjusted for inflation, that is roughly $8 million spent on a single evening. The guest list ran to 1,200 names. The newspapers devoted entire pages to descriptions of the costumes. Alva dressed as a Venetian princess. One guest came armored as a medieval knight. Another wore an outfit made entirely of cat fur. The flowers cost $11,000. The catering included everything from terrapin soup to champagne fountains that ran past midnight. But the true weapon was an invitation that was never sent. Mrs. Astor's daughter, Carrie, had been rehearsing a dance with friends to perform at the ball. When Carrie mentioned this to Alva's social secretary, the reply was devastating in its politeness. Mrs. Vanderbilt would be delighted to receive Miss Astor. But since Mrs. Astor had never called upon Mrs. Vanderbilt, no invitation could be issued. Protocol demanded that the older woman pay a social call first. Mrs. Astor sent her carriage to the Vanderbilt mansion the next afternoon. Her calling card was delivered on a silver tray. The invitation followed within the hour. It was the most expensive act of surrender in New York social history, and it taught Alva Vanderbilt a lesson she would never forget. Money alone could not open the doors of the American aristocracy, but money, applied with strategic precision, could blast those doors off their hinges. The question was, what happened when even that was not enough? Because here was the deeper problem. Even after Mrs. Astor's capitulation, the old families of New York still treated new money as a temporary illness. The Vanderbilts could throw balls, they could build mansions, they could fill their dining rooms with European art and their stables with English horses. But they could never be Astors, they could never be Livingstons or Stuyvesants. In America, social rank had a ceiling, and the industrial families had hit it. Across the Atlantic, however, there was a social currency that outranked everything. A currency that even Mrs. Astor could not manufacture. A title. A real one. The kind that came with a coat of arms, a seat in the House of Lords, and 1,000 years of lineage. If American society would not accept you, you would buy your way into a society that outranked it entirely. The mothers of the Gilded Age did the math. They looked at their daughters. They looked at the crumbling estates of England, and they began to plan. What they planned was not a marriage, it was an invasion. Chapter 2. A catalogue of eligible dukes priced by the page. There was a published directory that listed unmarried European noblemen alongside their titles, their estates, and their debts. It was called Titled Americans. First published in 1890, it ran to several editions and functioned with the clinical efficiency of a livestock catalog. Each entry listed the nobleman's rank, his country seat, his annual income, his known debts, and most critically, whether he was currently married. It was sold in New York bookshops. It was consulted in Fifth Avenue drawing rooms. And it was used by American mothers with the same cold pragmatism that their husbands applied to railroad prospectuses. The market it served was enormous, and it was driven by a collision of two economic crises on opposite sides of the Atlantic. In America, the problem was excess. The decades following the Civil War had produced the greatest concentration of private wealth in human history. Steel, railroads, oil, banking, mining. By 1890, there were over 4,000 millionaires in the United States. Their combined wealth exceeded the entire national budget. But money without social standing was, in the brutal calculus of Gilded Age New York, money without meaning. In Britain, the problem was collapse. The great agricultural estates that had sustained the landed aristocracy for centuries were failing. Cheap grain from America and Australia had flooded the market after the 1870s. Land rents plummeted. By 1880, the Duke of Marlborough's estate at Blenheim Palace was losing money every year. The Duke of Manchester was mortgaging his family seat. Dozens of lesser lords were selling off paintings, silver, and acreage just to keep the roof from falling in. The aristocracy had something America could not create: titles, lineage, and the social acceptance of European courts. America had something the aristocracy desperately needed: cash. The transatlantic marriage market was born from this mutual desperation. The London social season became the marketplace. Each spring, American mothers transported their daughters across the Atlantic. They rented houses in Mayfair. They hired social secretaries who knew which doors to knock on. They paid fees to be presented at the court of St. James, where the Queen herself would receive a curtsy from a girl whose grandfather had been a ferryman or a fur trader. A single court presentation could cost thousands of dollars when you counted the gown, the plumes, the train that had to be exactly the right length, and the social engagements required in the weeks that followed. The numbers tell the scale of the transfer. Between 1870 and 1914, 454 American heiresses married, titled Europeans. The combined value of their dowries, settlements, and ongoing payments exceeded $4 billion in modern currency. By 1905, more than a third of the House of Lords had American connections through marriage. 9 American women held the rank of Duchess, 33 were countesses, 46 were the wives of barons and baronets. This was not romance dressed in silk. It was a transaction dressed in orange blossoms. The contracts were drawn up by lawyers. The dowries were specified to the dollar. The annual payments were scheduled with the regularity of bond coupons. When the 9th Duke of Marlborough married Consuelo Vanderbilt, the contract stipulated $2.5 million in capital stock of the Beech Creek Railway Company, plus annual income guaranteed at 4%. The Duke's lawyers reviewed it. The Vanderbilt lawyers approved it, and Consuelo was not consulted. The mothers did not see this as cruelty. They saw it as promotion. A daughter who married a duke outranked every woman in New York. She outranked Mrs. Astor herself. The title could not be revoked. It could not be lost in a bank panic. It was permanent. And permanence, in a country where fortunes rose and fell with the stock ticker, was the most valuable thing money could buy. But there was a cost that no contract could specify and no lawyer could negotiate away, and it would be paid by the brides. Chapter 3. The Matchmaker Mothers and Their Glittering Trap. The women who brokered these marriages were not fools. They were tacticians who understood that a daughter's tears dried faster than a title's shine faded. 3 mothers will anchor this story. Each of them waged a different campaign. Each of them believed they were giving their daughters the world, and each of them left wreckage that would take decades to measure. The first was Alva Vanderbilt, and we have already seen her in combat. Having conquered Mrs. Astor, Alva set her sights higher. Her daughter Consuelo, born in 1877, was tall, dark-haired, and possessed of the kind of gentle temperament that made her perfectly suited for affection and perfectly vulnerable to control. Alva began training Consuelo for an aristocratic marriage before the girl reached adolescence. French governesses, dancing masters, instruction in the history and protocol of European courts, and, most notoriously, a steel rod strapped to Consuelo's spine to enforce perfect posture. The campaign had a single objective: the Duke of Marlborough. Not because Consuelo wanted him, because Alva did. The second mother operated with softer hands, but equal ambition. Mary Victoria Later was the wife of Levi Later, co-founder of what would become Marshall Field and Company, the great Chicago department store. Mary raised her daughter, also named Mary, but known as Mary Curzon after her marriage, with one goal in mind: the highest social position the British Empire could offer. Young Mary Leiter was educated in Washington society, presented at the court of St. James, and positioned with surgical precision in the social circles where she would encounter George Nathaniel Curzon, the brilliant young politician destined for the viceroyalty of India. When the match was made, Mary Leiter's dowry funded the political career that would carry her daughter to a throne room in Delhi. Mary Curzon would become Vicereine of India, the highest social position any American woman achieved in the British Empire. The cost was her health, her freedom, and ultimately her life. She died at 36, worn out by the demands of a role her mother had chosen for her. The third mother was also a bridge. Consuelo Iznaga was born in 1853 to a wealthy Cuban-American family. Her marriage to the 8th Duke of Manchester in 1876 was one of the earliest transatlantic unions and blazed the trail that hundreds of American heiresses would follow. But Consuelo Iznaga's role in our story is more specific. She became the godmother and social mentor of young Consuelo Vanderbilt, and she served as one of the key intermediaries who connected American families with the British aristocracy. She knew the rules of London society because she had learned them through bruising personal experience. Her own marriage was unhappy. The Duke of Manchester spent her money freely and gave little warmth in return. Yet she continued to broker matches, operating as a kind of ambassador between two worlds that viewed each other with mutual contempt and mutual need. These three women shared a conviction that ran deeper than snobbery. They had lived through an era in which women possessed almost no legal identity separate from their husbands. They could not vote. In most states, they could not own property independently. The only power available to them was social power. And the only social power that could not be taken away was a title. A duchess outranked a millionaire's wife forever. It did not matter if the duke was a drunk, a gambler, or a bore. The title endured. This was the logic. It was brutal, and it was rational, and it was applied to daughters who had no voice in the matter. By 1894, the machinery was set. Consuelo Vanderbilt had been groomed. Mary Leiter had been positioned. Helena Zimmerman, daughter of a Cincinnati oil baron, was entering the debutante season. The mothers had identified their targets. The contracts were being drafted. The transatlantic liners were booked. What happened next would play out in locked bedrooms, freezing palaces, and courtrooms on both sides of the ocean. And the daughters who endured it would spend the rest of their lives trying to understand whether their mothers had loved them or merely deployed them. Chapter 4. The Girl Who Wore a Steel Rod to Learn Obedience. Before Consuelo Vanderbilt was sold to a duke, her mother strapped a metal brace to her spine and forbade her from choosing her own clothing. The device was a steel rod sewn into a corset-like garment. It forced Consuelo to sit, stand, and walk with the rigid posture that Alva believed a duchess must possess. It was worn during lessons. It was worn during meals. It was worn during the long hours of instruction in French, music, and the genealogies of English noble families that Alva had made the centerpiece of her daughter's education. Years later, Consuelo would describe the brace in her memoir with the flat precision of someone recounting a medical procedure. It was not punishment, her mother explained. It was preparation. The preparation went deeper than posture. Alva controlled every dimension of Consuelo's life with the systematic thoroughness of a general managing a campaign. The girl was not permitted to choose her own dresses. She was not permitted to have private conversations with friends. Her reading material was selected by her mother. Her social calendar was managed by her mother. Her meals were supervised. Her correspondence was reviewed. Every hour of every day was accounted for in a regime that left no room for independent thought and no space for private feeling. A riding crop was reportedly kept nearby during lessons, not always used, but always visible. Its presence was the point. The threat of punishment was as effective as punishment itself. Consuelo grew up in a Fifth Avenue mansion that cost millions to build, surrounded by art, attended by servants, educated by the finest tutors money could hire. And she was, by every meaningful measure, a prisoner. The luxury was the cage. The education was the training. The mother was the warden. Alva's methods went beyond the physical. She isolated Consuelo from peers who might introduce rebellious ideas. Friendships were screened. Visitors were monitored. The world outside the Vanderbilt orbit was presented as dangerous, unworthy, and beneath the station that Alva had designated for her daughter. Consuelo would later describe her childhood as one of magnificent loneliness. She had everything except the one thing children need most: permission to become themselves. Consuelo was, by every account, a striking young woman, tall and slender, with large dark eyes and an expression that photographers captured as something between dignity and sadness. She had intelligence. She had warmth. She had, in the way of young women trapped inside elaborate cages, a capacity for dreaming that made the cage even more painful. And at 17, she fell in love. His name was Winthrop Rutherford. He was a New York socialite, handsome, charming, and thoroughly American. Consuelo adored him. He adored her. There was talk of marriage. Alva found out and moved with the speed of a general, closing a breach in the line. The response was total. Alva forbade Consuelo from seeing Rutherford. She removed the girl from New York social life. She took her daughter to Europe, where Consuelo would be kept under constant surveillance, while Alva finalized negotiations with the 9th Duke of Marlborough, Charles Spencer Churchill. The Duke was 23 years old. He was short. He was formal. He was, by his own later admission, not in love with Consuelo. What he needed was money. Blenheim Palace, the vast Baroque estate that had been the Churchill family seat since the early 1700s, was on the verge of financial ruin. American money, delivered in the form of a Vanderbilt dowry, would save it. The negotiations proceeded like a corporate merger. Alva's lawyers and the Duke's lawyers exchanged proposals. The final settlement was worth roughly $2.5 million in Beech Creek Railway stock, transferred to the Duke upon marriage. An additional annual income of $100,000 was guaranteed. The Vanderbilt family would eventually transfer roughly $20 million in total to the Marlborough household over the following years. In modern terms, this was a fortune exceeding $300 million. Consuelo was not part of these discussions. Her consent was not sought. Her feelings about the Duke were not relevant. When the moment came, Alva locked the door. The scene took place in a bedroom on the upper floor of the Vanderbilt mansion on 72nd Street. Consuelo has described it in detail. Alva told her daughter that if she did not agree to the marriage, Alva would suffer a fatal heart attack. She would die, and her death would be Consuelo's fault. There are accounts that suggest Alva also produced a doctor who confirmed the threat, telling Consuelo that her mother's heart condition was genuine and that emotional distress could kill her. Whether the doctor was real or fabricated remains disputed. What is not disputed is the result. Consuelo agreed to marry the Duke of Marlborough. The weeks between her capitulation and the ceremony were a blur of fittings, contracts, and rehearsals. Consuelo moved through them like a person under anesthesia. The wedding dress was designed by a French dressmaker. It was white satin, embroidered with silver and pearls, with a train that stretched over 15 feet. It weighed enough that walking in it required practice. The veil was made of Brussels lace that had been in the Vanderbilt family. The bouquet was orchids. Every detail was chosen by Alva. The bride's only contribution was her body and her compliance. The wedding took place on November 6, 1895, at St. Thomas Episcopal Church on Fifth Avenue. It was the social event of the year. Over 2,000 people were invited. Crowds formed outside the church hours before the ceremony. Police were deployed to manage them. The newspapers devoted columns to the event, describing the gowns of the guests. the decoration of the church, the flowers that lined the aisle. Reporters jockeyed for position. Artists sketched the scene for illustrated papers. This was the biggest social transaction New York had witnessed, and every detail was public property, every detail except one. What the newspapers did not describe, because the veil hid it, was that the bride was crying. Consuelo later wrote that she wept through the entire ceremony. Her eyes were red, her voice barely audible during the vows. Her bouquet trembled in her hands. She was 18 years old. She was marrying a man she did not love, who did not love her, in a transaction that had been designed, negotiated, and executed by her mother. At the reception, the champagne flowed. The Duke smiled for the cameras. Alva received congratulations from every prominent family in New York. The contract was fulfilled. The title was secured. The Vanderbilts now outranked every family on Mrs. Astor's list. On the honeymoon, the Duke told Consuelo that he despised anything that was not British. It was not a confession of personal taste. It was a declaration of war against everything his new wife represented. She was American. She was currency. And now that the transaction was complete, her value was spent. The bride who had wept at the altar was about to discover what the title actually cost. Chapter 5. The Duchess in the Freezing Palace. Blenheim Palace had 187 rooms, and not a single one of them felt like home. Consuelo arrived at the estate in the winter following her wedding and found a monument to English grandeur that operated on a scale designed to intimidate rather than comfort. The palace, built in the early 1700s as a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough, spread across nearly 200,000 square feet. Its grounds encompassed over 2,000 acres. Capability Brown had designed the gardens. John Vanbrugh had designed the facade. The whole thing looked like a small city with ideas above its station. Inside, it was cold. Not metaphorically cold, physically cold. Blenheim had no central heating. The corridor stretched so long that walking from one wing to another was a genuine journey measured in minutes. In winter, the stone walls radiated chill. Fires were lit in individual rooms, but the heat traveled upward and outward while the cold crept in from every surface. Consuelo, raised in the heated luxury of a Fifth Avenue mansion, found herself wearing furs indoors. The plumbing was antiquated. The kitchens were so far from the dining room that food arrived tepid. Meals were formal. Conversation was prescribed. The household staff numbered in the dozens, and every one of them operated according to protocols that had been in place since Consuelo's husband's great-grandfather. The new Duchess was expected to learn these protocols. She was not expected to change them. Her mother-in-law, Albertha, the Dowager Duchess, set the tone early. According to Consuelo's later accounts, Albertha greeted her with a statement about dynasty. The first duty of the new Duchess was to produce a male heir. This was not a suggestion. It was a command rooted in the family's deepest anxiety. Without a direct male heir, the dukedom would pass to a junior branch of the Churchill family. Specifically, it might eventually reach the line that produced Winston Churchill, who was already a young man of obvious ambition. The Dowager Duchess reportedly made clear that preventing that little upstart Winston from inheriting was a matter of dynastic survival. The message was unmistakable. Consuelo had not married into a family. She had been purchased by an institution. Her function was reproductive. Her value was uterine. Everything else about her, her intelligence, her warmth, her American vivacity, was irrelevant at best and inconvenient at worst. Consuelo fulfilled this obligation. Her first son, John Albert William Spencer Churchill, was born in 1897, barely 2 years after the wedding. He would become the 10th Duke of Marlborough. A second son, Ivor Charles Spencer Churchill, followed in 1898. Consuelo had done her duty. She had produced 2 heirs. The machinery of aristocratic succession was satisfied, but the marriage itself was a desert, a vast, ornate, freezing desert. The Duke was distant. He was formal in public and cold in private. He spent lavishly with the particular entitlement of a man who had never earned $1 in his life and never intended to. Vanderbilt money funded renovations at Blenheim that would eventually total in the millions. The Duke purchased art. He bought jewels, including a set of pearls that had reportedly once belonged to Catherine the Great. He restored rooms that had not been touched in decades. He rebuilt the water terraces. He maintained the grounds to a standard that would have bankrupted a lesser fortune. He entertained on a scale befitting his rank, hosting shooting parties and weekend gatherings where the cream of English society ate Vanderbilt food and drank Vanderbilt wine, while privately noting how American the whole affair felt. And through all of this, Consuelo was an accessory, a necessary ornament. She sat at the end of a long table in a dining room designed for state occasions, separated from her husband by 15 feet of polished oak and a silence that no amount of crystal stemware could fill. She walked the grounds alone. She raised her sons with limited support from a husband who viewed parenting as a task for nursemaids and tutors. She wrote letters home that were carefully cheerful. She learned to keep her suffering in a place where no one could see it. The English aristocracy offered little comfort. To many of the Duke's peers, Consuelo was not a person. She was a rescue fund with good posture. The American dollar heiresses who married into the British nobility were viewed with a peculiar blend of gratitude and contempt. Grateful for the money, contemptuous of the origin. The old families took Vanderbilt cash and spent it on Vanderbilt restoration, while privately sneering at Vanderbilt taste. American manners were considered loud. American confidence was considered vulgar. American money was considered essential. Consuelo was isolated in a way that only vast wealth can produce. She had servants but no companions. She had rooms but no refuge. Her friends were few, and those she made were often other American brides who understood the specific loneliness of being rich, titled, and trapped. The palace that her dowry had saved was both her home and her prison. Its 187 rooms echoing with the footsteps of a woman who had been sold to the highest bidder and delivered to the coldest house in England. The total transfer of wealth from the Vanderbilt family to the Marlborough estate reached roughly $20 million over the years. In modern terms, that figure exceeds $350 million. It paid for the palace. It paid for the art. It paid for the lifestyle of a man who had married for money and spent it without gratitude. Consuelo endured this for more than a decade. The woman who had wept at the altar learned to compose her face into the expression expected of a duchess. She smiled when required. She hosted when demanded. She stood beside her husband at public events and performed the role her mother had purchased for her. But the question that hung over every freezing corridor, every silent meal, every night spent in separate bedrooms, was the one Consuelo would eventually answer with her life. How long could a woman endure a cage made of gold and titles before she decided that freedom was worth any scandal? That question was also being asked, in a different key, by another American bride whose cage was made of gambling debts and broken promises. Chapter 6. The Duke Who Gambled Away Her Entire Fortune. Helena Zimmerman brought a fortune built on Standard Oil to her marriage. Her husband converted it into gambling debts, mistresses, and shame. Helena was the only child of Eugene Zimmerman, a Cincinnati businessman who had made his wealth through investments in Standard Oil and various railroad enterprises. By the late 1890s, Eugene Zimmerman was one of the richest men in Ohio. Helena was his sole heiress. She was young, sheltered, and surrounded by a social world that measured a woman's worth by the quality of the man she could attract. The man who presented himself was Kim, the 9th Duke of Manchester. He was 20 years old in 1900 when the engagement was announced. He was charming, he was titled, and he was drowning in debt. The Duke of Manchester had already earned a reputation that should have stopped any careful father cold. He had been falsely claiming engagement to various wealthy young women for years. The purpose was simple. Each time he announced an engagement, his creditors would back off, assuming that a large dowry was imminent. By some accounts, he had falsely announced engagements to as many as 22 different women, each time buying himself a few more months of solvency before the engagement quietly dissolved. Eugene Zimmerman was not fooled. He knew exactly what the Duke was, but the social pressure was enormous. Helena's mother, who like Alva Vanderbilt and Mary later saw in a title the ultimate validation, pushed the match forward. A duke was a duke. The debts could be managed. The important thing was the rank. The marriage took place in November of 1900 at St. Thomas Church in New York, the same church where Consuelo Vanderbilt had wept 5 years earlier. Helena Zimmerman walked down the same aisle toward a similar transaction. Her dowry was substantial. The exact figure is debated by historians, but estimates place the immediate settlement at several $100,000, with ongoing income from the Zimmerman estate supporting the Duke's household. The money vanished almost immediately. The Duke of Manchester treated Helena's fortune the way fire treats paper. He gambled at the races. He gambled at private clubs. He kept mistresses in London and on the continent. He maintained a lifestyle built on champagne, tailored suits, first-class cabins, and the boundless confidence of a man who believed his title entitled him to spend, without limit, and account for nothing. Helena's dowry was supposed to rescue the Manchester estates, Kimbolton Castle, and its surrounding properties. Instead, it funded a young man's ongoing project of self-destruction. The castle received minimal attention while the Duke lived in London hotels and rented country houses that he decorated with other women. Helena found herself playing a role familiar to dollar princesses across England, the wife who financed a lifestyle she was barely permitted to share. The pattern was relentless and grinding. Money would arrive from the Zimmerman estate. The Duke would spend it. Creditors would appear at the door, sometimes literally, with writs and demands. More money would be requested from Cincinnati. Letters would cross the Atlantic, each one a little more desperate, each one a little more revealing. The cycle repeated year after year, each rotation stripping Helena of another layer of financial security and personal dignity. The fortune that was supposed to last generations was being consumed in a single generation by a single man's appetites. Eugene Zimmerman watched from Cincinnati with growing horror. Unlike Alva Vanderbilt, who had orchestrated her daughter's marriage with strategic enthusiasm, Zimmerman had been reluctant from the start. As the years passed and the Duke's behavior became impossible to ignore, Zimmerman took the only defensive action available to a man of his era and temperament. He rewrote his will. When Eugene Zimmerman died in 1914, his estate was structured so that the Duke of Manchester would inherit nothing directly. The money was placed in trusts that protected Helena and her children while cutting the Duke out of any meaningful inheritance. It was a father's belated attempt to shield his daughter using the only weapon he understood: money controlled from beyond the grave. The Duke was furious. He challenged the will. He lost. And the marriage, already hollowed out by years of infidelity and financial abuse, staggered on through sheer inertia. Helena stayed for 3 decades, 30 years of a marriage that had been a transaction from the first handshake. She stayed because divorce, in the early 20th century, was a scandal that could destroy a woman's social standing overnight. She stayed because her children bore the Manchester name and title, and divorce would mark them with a stigma that polite society would never fully forgive. She stayed because returning to Cincinnati as a failed duchess was a humiliation that the social world of her mother's generation could not absorb. And she stayed perhaps because staying was what she had been trained to do. The same system that sold her into the marriage had equipped her with only one skill for surviving it: endurance. The divorce finally came in 1931. Helena was 51 years old. She had entered the marriage as a girl of 20, with a fortune built on decades of American industrial enterprise. She emerged as a middle-aged woman whose best years had been spent watching a titled Englishman burn through her inheritance with the enthusiasm of a boy setting fire to autumn leaves. And here was the cruelest mathematics of the transatlantic marriage market. The families who had invested millions in a title refused to support a daughter's escape because the social capital would evaporate the moment the marriage ended. A divorced duchess was a contradiction in terms. She kept the courtesy title, but lost the position. She kept the memory of what she had endured, but lost the justification that was supposed to make it worthwhile. The investment, measured in millions, produced a return measured in decades of unhappiness and a title that rang hollow once the marriage was dissolved. Helena Zimmerman was not the only bride trapped by this logic. Across drawing rooms and country houses throughout England, American women were learning the same lesson. The dowry, once paid, could not be recovered. The title, once stained by divorce, could not be polished. The years, once spent, could not be reclaimed. The market had one direction. It moved wealth from America to England, from daughter to husband, from freedom to obligation. There was no return policy. There was no refund. The title that was supposed to be their armor had become their chain. And escape, when it came, would require a kind of courage that no amount of money could buy. Chapter 7. Escape was a scandal. Only the rich could survive. In an era when divorce could destroy a woman's reputation overnight, 3 American duchesses chose destruction over captivity. The legal machinery that trapped dollar princesses in unhappy marriages was formidable. Under English common law in the late 19th century, married women had sharply limited property rights. The Married Women's Property Acts of 1882 and 1893 had improved the situation somewhat, but in practice, a wife's wealth was entangled with her husband's household, his debts, and his estate. A woman who wanted to leave had to navigate a legal system designed by men, for men in which divorce was considered a moral failing rather than a legal remedy. The social costs were even steeper. In both England and America, a divorced woman was damaged goods. She was dropped from guest lists. She was whispered about at dinner parties. Doors that had opened for the Duchess closed for the divorcee. Her children suffered the stigma. They were the children of a broken home, a phrase that carried moral weight in an era when marriage was considered a sacrament, even when it was plainly a contract. Her family, having invested enormous sums in the marriage that produced the title, faced the humiliation of watching that investment dissolve. Many families responded to a daughter's plea for help with a simple, devastating calculation. The title is worth more than your happiness. Stay. The numbers bear this out. Of the 454 transatlantic marriages recorded between 1870 and 1914, the majority endured. Not because they were happy, but because the cost of leaving was unbearable. Those who did divorce faced years of legal proceedings, public scandal, and financial warfare. The settlements were brutal, fought by lawyers on both sides of the Atlantic, who understood that a duke's reputation and a father's fortune were both at stake. The custody battles were worse. English law favored the father. A mother who left could lose her children along with her title. The numbers themselves tell a story of entrapment. Of the 454 marriages, roughly 60 ended in divorce or formal separation. That is less than 15%. Compare this to the general divorce rate among the wealthy in the same period, which was already higher than the national average. Dollar princess marriages were more durable than their domestic counterparts, not because they were happier, but because the barriers to exit were higher. The title was a lock. The dowry was a bolt. The family's expectations were the walls. Consuelo Vanderbilt chose to leave anyway. The formal separation came in 1906, after 11 years of marriage. By then, the pretense of a functioning union had collapsed entirely. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough lived separate lives. They appeared together at official functions and retreated to opposite ends of the palace afterward. The separation was negotiated quietly, as such things were among the aristocracy, with lawyers and intermediaries managing the financial terms while both parties maintained a public facade of dignified regret. But separation was not divorce. Consuelo remained the Duchess of Marlborough. She remained legally tied to a man she had not chosen and could not love. The full divorce would not come until 1921, a full 26 years after the wedding at St. Thomas Church. 26 years. The mathematics of that duration deserve a moment of silence. Consuelo was 18 when she married. She was 44 when the divorce was finalized. She had spent more than half her life in a marriage that began with tears and ended with legal documents. The broader pattern was equally grim. American heiresses who married into the British aristocracy faced additional obstacles. Their dowries, once transferred, were nearly impossible to recover. The money had been spent on estates, art, and debt reduction. A divorced duchess could claim her title as a courtesy, but could not reclaim the millions that had funded her husband's lifestyle. Some brides fought back with weapons other than lawyers. They threw themselves into charitable work, building parallel lives that gave them purpose beyond the drawing room. They built social networks independent of their husbands, cultivating friendships with other American brides who understood the particular language of their isolation. They traveled, sometimes for months at a time, putting an ocean between themselves and the men they had been sold to. They wrote letters, diaries, and eventually memoirs that documented the truth behind the fairy tale. Consuelo Vanderbilt became an active philanthropist during her years as Duchess, founding hostels for young women in London and supporting medical charities that served the poor. the irony was sharp. The woman who had no power over her own life devoted herself to improving the lives of others. The woman who could not choose her own husband chose instead to choose causes. It was not freedom, but it was something that resembled agency in a world that had stripped her of the real thing. Others endured in silence. The dollar princesses who remained in unhappy marriages left fewer records. Their suffering was private, woven into the fabric of daily life so thoroughly that it became invisible. Their accommodations were personal. They learned to manage husbands who drank, gambled, or kept mistresses with the same practical skill they applied to managing a household. They developed strategies for survival, separate bedrooms, separate schedules, separate lives conducted under the same ancient roof. They raised children who would inherit titles built on purchased foundations. They grew old in houses that American money had saved, and English custom had imprisoned them within. The escape, when it finally came for women like Consuelo, required more than courage. It required money to hire lawyers on 2 continents, money to maintain independence after the divorce, money to survive the social exile that followed, the cold years when invitations stopped arriving and old friends crossed to the other side of the street. Divorce was a scandal only the rich could survive, and even among the rich, the scars lasted decades. But the most extraordinary escape was not a legal one. It was a moral transformation so complete that it still defies easy explanation. The woman who had locked her daughter in a room and forced her into marriage would spend her final decades fighting for every woman's right to choose her own destiny. Chapter 8. The suffragette who once sold her own daughter. The woman who testified, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," would spend her final decades fighting for women's right to choose their own destinies. Alva Vanderbilt's life after Consuelo's wedding reads like a novel written by someone who did not believe in consistent characters. In 1895, the year of Consuelo's forced marriage, Alva herself divorced William Kissam Vanderbilt. The divorce was a scandal. It was front-page news. Alva named his mistress. She demanded and received a settlement that included the marble house in Newport and a substantial annual income. Then, in 1896, she married Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, a wealthy socialite and horse breeder. The marriage was happy. Belmont adored Alva. He gave her something William K. Vanderbilt never had: respect as an equal. And somewhere in this second marriage, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont began to change. The transformation was not sudden. It was not a single moment of revelation. But by the early 1900s, the woman who had controlled every aspect of her daughter's life was becoming one of America's most vocal advocates for women's autonomy. She began attending suffrage meetings. She began donating money. She began speaking publicly about women's right to vote, to own property, to control their own destinies. In 1909, after Oliver Belmont's death, Alva threw herself into the suffrage movement with the same ferocity she had once applied to social climbing. She founded the Political Equality Association. She opened her Newport mansion, Marble House, for suffrage rallies, turning a monument to Gilded Age excess into a platform for democratic reform. She funded newspapers that argued the case for women's enfranchisement. She organized marches through the streets of New York, walking alongside factory workers and school teachers in a public display of solidarity that would have horrified the Mrs. Astor of 20 years earlier. She helped finance the picketing of the White House in 1917, when suffragists stood outside Woodrow Wilson's gates demanding the vote. Some of those women were arrested, Some were force-fed in prison. Alva paid their bail and their legal fees. She was tireless. She was generous. She was, in the vocabulary of the suffrage movement, fearless. She testified before Congress. She gave speeches to crowds that numbered in the thousands. She used her wealth and her social connections to open doors for a movement that had struggled for decades to be taken seriously by the political establishment. When the 19th Amendment was ratified in 1920, granting women the right to vote, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont was among the women who had made it possible. The contradiction is staggering. It demands examination. The same woman who had denied her daughter the right to choose her own husband was now demanding that all women have the right to choose their own government. The same woman who had used emotional blackmail, physical control, and locked doors to force a teenager into a loveless marriage was now marching under banners that read, "Votes for Women." The same hands that had strapped a steel rod to a child's spine now held placards calling for liberation. How do you reconcile these two Alvas? One answer is that you don't. People contain contradictions. The woman who sold her daughter to a duke and the woman who fought for the vote existed in the same body, driven by the same fundamental engine, the need for power in a world that denied it to women. When the only power available was social rank, Alva pursued social rank with ruthless efficiency. When political power became possible, she pursued that instead. The goal was never her daughter's happiness. The goal was never abstract justice. The goal was control, first over her family's position, then over the political landscape. But there is another answer, and it is more generous. Alva watched her daughter suffer. She watched the marriage she had engineered produce isolation, unhappiness, and a slow erosion of everything that had made Consuelo vibrant. And perhaps, in watching that suffering, Alva began to understand what she had done, not immediately, not completely, but enough to redirect her formidable energy toward a cause that might prevent other women from being trapped by the same system. In 1926, more than 3 decades after the wedding at St. Thomas Church, Alva Vanderbilt Belmont appeared before the Vatican's Rota Tribunal. She was there to testify in support of Consuelo's petition for annulment. The Catholic Church required proof that the marriage had been coerced. Alva provided it. Her testimony was devastating. She stated, under oath, that she had forced Consuelo to marry the Duke of Marlborough. She described the locked room. She described the emotional pressure. She described what she called her absolute power over her daughter. It was the most complete confession of maternal coercion in the historical record of the Gilded Age. The annulment was granted. Consuelo's marriage to the Duke was declared null in the eyes of the Church. 31 years after the ceremony, the union was officially erased. And then Alva did something quieter and, in its way, more revealing than any public testimony. She bought a chateau in the south of France, near the home where Consuelo had settled after her divorce. She spent her final years there, close to the daughter she had once controlled with the precision of a military commander. The two women found what biographers describe as an uneasy peace. Not forgiveness, exactly, something more complicated. An acknowledgement that the damage was real and that the time remaining was short. Alva Vanderbilt Belmont died on January 26, 1933, at the age of 80. Her funeral was attended by suffragists, socialites, and her daughter. Consuelo was 55 years old. She had spent her entire adult life navigating the wreckage of her mother's ambition. The suffragette who once sold her own daughter left behind a legacy that refuses to resolve into a simple verdict. She was a villain and a pioneer. She was a tyrant and a liberator. And the woman who understood her best was the daughter who could never fully forgive her. Chapter 9. The Bride Who Finally Married for Love. On July 4th, 1921, Consuelo Vanderbilt signed her divorce papers and married a man who had been in love with her since the night of her debut, 26 years earlier. His name was Jacques Balsan. He was a French aviator, a pioneer of early flight, a man of independent wealth, and a man who had been quietly devoted to Consuelo since he first encountered her at a society event in the 1890s. While she endured her years as Duchess of Marlborough, Jacques waited, not passively. He lived his own life. He flew airplanes. He served France during the First World War. But when Consuelo's separation from the Duke became public, Jacques was there. When the divorce was finalized, he proposed. The wedding was small. It was private. It was everything that the ceremony at St. Thomas Church had not been. No 2,000 guests, no police controlling crowds, no newspaper reporters cataloging every stitch of the gown. Just two people who had chosen each other. Consuelo was 44 years old. She had spent 26 years married to a man selected by her mother. She had raised 2 sons in a palace that American money had rescued, and English custom had made her prison. She had endured isolation, coldness, and the particular cruelty of being valued only for the fortune she carried. And now, finally, she was free to choose. The Balsans settled in France. They lived at a property called Le Souay near Dreux, and later at a chateau in Normandy. Jacques was warm where the Duke had been cold. He was affectionate where the Duke had been formal. He was interested in Consuelo as a person rather than as a financial instrument. He asked her opinions. He valued her company. He treated her as a partner rather than a possession. The marriage, by every account, was happy, genuinely happy. Not the performed happiness of aristocratic obligation, but the real thing, arrived at late and treasured, precisely because of its lateness. There is something almost unbearable about that happiness. Consuelo had waited 26 years for it. She had endured a forced marriage, a cold palace, a distant husband, the hostility of English society, and the slow erosion of her youth. She had been a commodity, a cash infusion, a breeding machine, and a decorative fixture. And then, at 44, she discovered what it felt like to be loved by someone who had chosen to love her. The simplicity of it was the cruelest commentary on the system that had stolen her youth. Consuelo lived this second life with a freedom she had never known. She gardened. She entertained friends on her own terms, inviting who she pleased and turning away no one for lack of title. She maintained relationships with her sons, both of whom had grown into men carrying the weight of their parents' public unhappiness. She traveled through Europe. She read widely. She lived the quiet, self-directed existence that had been denied to her since the moment Alva first strapped the steel rod to her spine. Helena Zimmermann, too, found a second chapter. After her divorce from the Duke of Manchester in 1931, Helena eventually remarried. In 1937, she wed the 10th Earl of Kintore. The second marriage was quieter, steadier, and lasted nearly 3 decades until the Earl's death. Helena had survived the worst of the transatlantic marriage market and emerged with enough resilience to try again. That she chose another titled Englishman suggests either the depth of the world she had been absorbed into, or a genuine affection that transcended the categories of the market, perhaps both. But the most significant act of Consuelo's later years was not her marriage, it was her memoir. In 1953, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan published The Glitter and the Gold. The title itself was a verdict. Glitter, the surface brilliance of titles, jewels, palaces, and the social machinery that produced them. Gold, the money that paid for all of it. The book named the system. It described the forced marriage. It described the steel brace. It described the locked room. It described the tears at the altar. It described the cold palace and the colder husband. And it did so in prose that was dignified, precise, and devastating. The memoir was an act of reclamation. Consuelo had been traded, by contract and by force, from one family to another. Her body, her dowry, her fertility, and her freedom had been currency in a transaction designed by others. By writing her own story, she took back the narrative. She was no longer the weeping bride, she was the author. The book also served as testimony for a generation. Consuelo was not the only dollar princess, but she was the most famous and the most articulate. Her memoir gave voice to the hundreds of American women who had been married off to European aristocrats in exchange for titles and social standing. Most of those women left no record. Their suffering was private. Their accommodations were silent. Consuelo spoke for them. She died on December 6, 1964, at the age of 87. She had outlived her mother by more than 30 years. She had outlived the Duke of Marlborough, who died in 1934. She had outlived the world that had created her, used her, and finally released her. On her deathbed, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan was not a duchess. She was not a commodity. She was a woman who had been sold as a girl and had spent a lifetime earning back her own name. Chapter 10. The Palaces That American Money Saved from Ruin. Blenheim Palace still stands today because a weeping teenager from New York paid for it with her life's happiness. This is not metaphor. The financial records are clear. When the 9th Duke of Marlborough married Consuelo Vanderbilt in 1895, the estate was on the brink of ruin. Agricultural income had been falling for 2 decades. The cost of maintaining 187 rooms, 2,000 acres, and a staff of dozens had outpaced every revenue source. Without the Vanderbilt dowry and the millions in subsequent transfers, Blenheim would have faced the fate that consumed dozens of other English great houses: partial demolition, sale to developers, or slow decay into a ruin picturesque enough for watercolors but too expensive for habitation. Today, Blenheim Palace is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It receives hundreds of thousands of visitors each year. It is celebrated as one of the finest examples of English Baroque architecture. The guidebooks mention Vanbrugh. They mention Capability Brown. They mention Churchill. They do not always mention Consuelo. The pattern repeats across England, estate after estate, castle after castle, each one a monument to American money delivered through American brides. Flore's Castle in Scotland, seat of the Dukes of Roxburgh, was rescued by the marriage of the 8th Duke to May Gaulet, daughter of a New York real estate fortune. Her dowry funded restorations that preserved the castle well into the 20th century. The Gaulet money rebuilt what centuries of Scottish weather had worn down. Chatsworth, seat of the Dukes of Devonshire, benefited from American connections. Highclere Castle, which the world would later know as the setting for Downton Abbey, was another estate sustained in part by the infusion of American wealth through strategic marriages. Dozens of lesser estates, country houses, and manor homes were pulled back from the edge of financial collapse by American money delivered through American brides who had no say in where the money went once the contracts were signed. The scale of the transfer demands accounting: 454 marriages, combined dowries and settlements exceeding $4 billion in modern value, annual payments structured like bond coupons, arriving quarterly, sustaining lifestyles that the English countryside could no longer fund on its own, trust funds designed to sustain estates for generations, carefully structured by American lawyers to protect the capital even as the English husbands tried to spend through it. Real estate, railroad stock, oil money, banking wealth, and industrial profits poured across the Atlantic and into the crumbling foundations of English aristocratic life. By 1905, one estimate suggests that more than 1/3 of the sitting members of the House of Lords had American connections through marriage. The British upper class was being subsidized by the American upper class, and the medium of exchange was young women. The physical legacy is everywhere. Walk through any English country house that survived the 20th century intact and ask, who paid for this? The roofs that did not leak because American money replaced the slate. The galleries that were restored because American money hired the craftsmen. The gardens that were maintained because American money paid the gardeners. The art collections that were assembled or preserved because American money outbid the creditors. American money saved a version of England that England itself could no longer afford. It saved the fiction that the aristocracy was self-sustaining. It saved the illusion that the great houses stood on their own. But the human cost is buried in footnotes. The women who paid for these palaces are remembered, when they are remembered at all, as curiosities. The dollar princesses, the American duchesses, terms that reduce complex human beings to their function in a financial transaction. Guidebooks mention the architects. They mention the landscapers. They mention the dukes who commissioned the work. They do not always mention the American girls whose dowries made it possible. The palaces stand. The women who saved them are ghosts walking corridors they paid for but never owned. Consider the accounting from the other side. What did the brides receive in exchange for the millions they carried across the Atlantic? A title, a cold house, a husband chosen by contract, a society that viewed them as outsiders carrying welcome money, isolation from their families, legal systems that trapped them, and the knowledge, arriving slowly over years, that the glitter was just glitter and the gold belonged to someone else. The palaces remain. The price remains unpaid. Chapter 11. The Daughters of Daughters and the Silence They Inherited. The children born from these transactional marriages carried both titles and trauma into the 20th century. Consuelo Vanderbilt's two sons inherited a fractured legacy. The elder, John, became the 10th Duke of Marlborough upon his father's death in 1934. He inherited Blenheim Palace, the title, and the complicated inheritance of being the son of two people who had been miserable together. John was by most accounts a reserved man. He married twice. He maintained the estate. He carried the name. Whether he carried the scars of his parents' visible unhappiness is a matter his private life kept private. The younger son, Ivor, took a different path. Lord Ivor Spencer Churchill became an artist and a collector, a man whose temperament recalled his mother more than his father. he never sought the public stage. He lived quietly. He painted. In the way of second sons, he was both freed and forgotten by the system of primogeniture that governed his family. Helena Zimmerman's children bore a more public burden. The Duke of Manchester's behavior, his gambling, his infidelity, his reckless spending, played out in newspapers on both sides of the Atlantic. The children grew up under the shadow of a father whose name appeared in gossip columns and courtroom reports. The stigma of their parents' eventual divorce followed them. The Manchester title, sustained for one generation by Zimmerman money, continued in diminished circumstances. But the most remarkable generational echo reaches further than any of these families expected. Frances Ellen Work was born in 1857, the daughter of Frank Work, a wealthy New York stockbroker. In 1880, she married James Boothby Burke Roche, who would become the third Baron Fermoy. It was another transatlantic match, another American fortune married to a British title. The marriage was unhappy. Frances divorced Roche in 1891, one of the earliest dollar princess divorces. She returned to America with her children. Her granddaughter, Ruth Roche, married into the Spencer family. Ruth's daughter, Frances, married Edward John Spencer, the 8th Earl Spencer, and their daughter, born on July 1st, 1961, was named Diana. Diana Spencer, Princess Diana, the most famous woman in the world, the great-granddaughter of a dollar princess. The echo is unmistakable. The transatlantic marriage market of the Gilded Age produced a lineage that led directly to the woman who would marry the Prince of Wales, captivate the world, and die in a Paris tunnel in 1997. The same patterns repeated across the generations, as if the original transaction had imprinted itself on the family's DNA. A young woman married into a family that valued lineage over love. A bride who discovered that her husband's heart belonged to someone else. A union that crumbled publicly while the institution demanded it hold together privately. A mother-in-law who prioritized the crown over the individual. Diana's suffering played out on television screens rather than in the private corridors of Blenheim Palace. But the architecture of the pain was the same. The dollar princess pattern, a young woman sacrificed to an institution larger than herself, had survived a century and arrived intact at the gates of Buckingham Palace. World War I ended the dollar princess phenomenon. The catastrophe that consumed Europe between 1914 and 1918 destroyed the economic and social machinery that had made the transatlantic marriage market possible. The great estates that had depended on agricultural income and American dowries lost a generation of heirs in the trenches of France and Belgium. Young men who had grown up in houses saved by American money died in mud that knew nothing of titles or dowries. The aristocracy that had sold its titles for cash was decimated. Entire family lines were extinguished. The social order that had priced a duke at $2 million and a baron at $200,000 collapsed under the weight of mechanized warfare and the democratic reforms that followed. The world that emerged from the war had no patience for the old arrangements. Income taxes rose. Death duties consumed estates. The great houses that American money had saved now faced threats that no dowry could address. Some were demolished. Some were donated to the National Trust. Some opened their doors to paying visitors, turning the private palaces of the aristocracy into tourist attractions where the public could marvel at the splendor that their own social system had never offered them. The daughters of daughters inherited the silence. They inherited the titles. They inherited the complicated legacy of being descended from transactions rather than romances, from contracts rather than courtships. And they carried those inheritances, quietly, into a century that would judge their grandmother's bargains by standards that did not exist when the deals were made. Chapter 12. The Price of a Title Measured in a Mother's Confession. Alva Vanderbilt's 6-word testimony remains the most devastating epitaph for an entire era. I have always had absolute power. Those words, spoken under oath before the Vatican Tribunal in 1926, were not a boast. They were a confession. And they named the force that drove 454 American women across the Atlantic and into marriages that treated them as currency rather than people. Absolute power. Not the power of governments or armies, the power of a mother over a daughter in a world where women had almost no power at all. Alva Vanderbilt had wielded that power with extraordinary precision. She had selected the target. She had trained the weapon. She had negotiated the contract. And when the weapon resisted, she had locked it in a room and threatened to die. But Alva's confession was also an indictment of the system that created her. She was not an aberration. She was a product. The Gilded Age taught women that their only currency was social position, and that the only way to acquire social position was through marriage. Alva learned this lesson perfectly. She applied it to herself first, marrying William K. Vanderbilt for his money. Then she applied it to her daughter, marrying Consuelo to the Duke for his title. The logic was consistent, the cruelty was structural, and the damage was generational. In her final years, Alva lived near Consuelo in the south of France. The distance between their homes was small. The distance between their hearts was harder to measure. Biographers describe their later relationship as a kind of armed truce. There were visits. There were conversations. There were moments of warmth that surfaced through the scar tissue of decades. Consuelo had not forgiven her mother, but she had, perhaps, come to understand her, to see Alva not as a monster, but as a woman trapped by the same system she had inflicted on her daughter. Alva died on January 26, 1933, at 80 years old. At her funeral, the suffragists came. They honored her as a pioneer. The National Woman's Party, which she had funded and championed, sent representatives. The obituaries praised her courage, her generosity, her lifelong fight for women's rights. They mentioned the Vanderbilt name. They mentioned the Belmont name. They mentioned the votes she had helped win. They did not always mention the girl she had locked in a room. Consuelo lived on for 31 more years. She lived in France with Jacques Balsan. She tended her garden. She wrote her memoir. She watched the world she had been born into recede further and further into history, becoming first quaint, then incomprehensible, then the subject of period dramas and historical curiosities. She died in 1964, at 87. Between 1870 and 1914, 454 American women were married to European titles. Their combined dowries exceeded $4 billion in modern value. They saved palaces. They funded estates. They propped up a class system that viewed them with gratitude and contempt in equal measure. They bore children who inherited titles and trauma. They endured marriages that were contracts masquerading as sacraments. And when they finally broke free, decades later, they discovered what Consuelo named in her memoir's title, "It was all glitter, and it was all gold. The glitter blinded, the gold imprisoned. The brides wept at their weddings. Their mothers wiped their eyes and counted the titles. And the palaces that American money built still stand today, beautiful and cold, monuments to the oldest transaction in the world, the sale of a daughter for something her mother wanted more than her happiness. The price of a title is not paid in money. It is paid in years. It is paid in silence. It is paid in the distance between a mother and a daughter who might have loved each other freely if the world had not taught them that love was a currency too cheap to spend. 454 brides, $4 billion, and one mother's confession that explains them all. I have always had absolute power over my daughter. The power was real, the daughter was real, and the cost, finally, was everything.